Okay, so we are finally starting. We are going to have two papers today, and I suggest we use the limited number of papers today for more extended and interesting discussions than usual, because usually we have like 4, 3. All right, so the first person to speak is Zachary, Reyna, and he gives a paper called Throwing Out the Baby with the Bathwater, Rethinking Nature with Aquinas for Contemporary Environmental Politics. Please.
Hello. Change my glasses. Okay. So, like Andre said, the title is Throwing Out the Baby with the Bathwater, Rethinking Nature with Aquinas for Contemporary Environmental Politics. And I've prepared a few remarks, so I'll read them, but we'll go through the presentation as well. So what I want to present to you this evening is an argument for why nature, as a concept and term of art, should be retained by contemporary environmental politics, despite claims over the past 30 years by theorists like Bruno Latour and environmental historians like William Cronin to the contrary. In other words, what I want to do is offer an argument for what nature might continue to offer us as 21st century participants engaging in the critical task of rethinking the boundaries between nature and politics, the human and the non-human. Or one last time, what we lose when we jettison nature as a concept. This is what my title, Throwing Out the Baby with the Bathwater, is in reference to. I am not sure how the proverb works in Russian, but in English we have the saying, do not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it means something like, be careful when you discard or throw something away. Some things need to be thrown out, but others are precious and should be retained. It is my task this evening to show you what is precious or important in the concept nature, and therefore should be retained. Just as a side note, it is important to not take the title too literally in the context of environmental politics. This works in English, where the phrase is a well-known proverb. But in short, the title does not mean to suggest an environmental policy recommendation, to discard dirty bathwater and save the babies. In fact, in an era of exponential human population expansion and water scarcity, it may be more prudential to retain the bathwater and discard the babies. But this judgment I leave open to you for the time being. So, to make this argument, I would turn to the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, and in particular, his account of natural law. But why, you may ask? This is an appropriate question. Aquinas died nearly 750 years ago in a very different world than we live today. He was a Roman Catholic cleric and scholar, and his writing seems more devoted to theology, moral law, and logic than care for the earth. You, my critic, might continue, if you are certain you want to work with medieval thought, at least pick Aquinas' contemporary, St. Francis of Assisi. He was a well-known lover of animals. His poems call the moon and sun sister and brother, and he is the namesake of the current Roman Pope, also known as the Green Pope, for his encyclical Laudato Si, on care for our common home. And this is a contrast between Aquinas up on the top there, holding his book, gazing at a built church, and St. Francis with all the birds around him, and one of his canticles, St. Francis's canticles, talking about the moon being his sister and the sun being his brother. Yet, Aquinas is important to turn to for at least 2 reasons, I believe. First, along with many of his contemporaries, like Francis of Assisi, who I just mentioned, Aquinas was involved in the huge task of reintroducing and synthesizing natural philosophy, the disciplines that would become our hard sciences today into the Christian West. In other words, Aquinas was present at the birth of the modern conception of nature we now see being abandoned. Aristotle, who wrote in the 4th century BCE, had an extensive natural philosophy that was very influential in the ancient world. His writing included extensive texts on the observation and recording of animal behavior and mating patterns and physical experiments that was unknown in the Neoplatonist tradition dominant in the West. Aristotle's natural philosophy texts were never translated into Latin, and all but forgotten until their reintroduction in the 12th century CE, when they were reintroduced through Islamic sources. And this reintroduction of Aristotle did not go too smoothly. And these are some of the jokes that were made in the later Middle Ages, earlier Renaissance, that there's this common painting, I believe it's by Raphael, where Plato is pointing to the heavens and Aristotle is pointing towards the ground. He's the empiricist. He's interested in observation, and Plato's interested in thinking about the ideas. And this is what got Aristotle into trouble. He was too interested in the sensuous and having his nose in the dirt. And this is a legend that came up after his reintroduction in the late Middle Ages in the West, that he was abused by his pupil Alexander the Great's mistress or lover Phyllis, that she rode him like a donkey and whipped him. So these are some. This is a woodcut from 1513 and a bronze statue of him being slapped from the 14th century. Let's see, where was I? What we see at the end of the 12th century, though, and through the 13th century, then, is for the first time a growing discussion about nature, natura, as a scientific concept that continues, I want to suggest, to this day. And it's thanks to Aristotle's reintroduction that people like Francis and Aquinas start talking about nature, not just in terms of a moral concept, but in terms of a scientific concept, or in terms of the observation of the world around them. Second, and I can get off the screen. Second, rethinking nature with Aquinas is not simply an attempt to shore up the concept of nature by one of its earliest Western articulators in the era of its theoretical decline. That would be both useless for contemporary environmental politics — we do not, after all, live in the 13th century — and worse, from a scholarly theoretical position, because it would simply reproduce the caricature of Aquinas we have received. No, in rethinking nature with Aquinas, my proposal is to locate those obscured spots in Aquinas' thinking about nature that might jolt us, literally move us into rethinking the possibilities for nature as a concept today, and consequently what we lose when we abandon the concept nature. And my answer, in short, just to preview, is that what we lose when we abandon the concept nature is something like the ability to belong to establish and work at friendship with — those are Aquinas' terms — the more than human world we inhabit. And the crucial point, I think, and Aquinas helps us see this, is that this friendship goes beyond merely acknowledging our interconnectedness and relationality, as important as that may be, and requires a certain care for and respect for boundaries, as anyone who has ever tried to make friends and failed knows. First, though, it is worth making clear just how much of a tension this puts me in with the majority of critical movements in environmental and conservationist politics today. I mentioned a few of the proponents of this post-nature or after-nature turn at the start of my talk, but let me explain a bit. Bruno Latour, whose book is in the middle there, is one of the most visible advocates of the post-nature turn. In The Politics of Nature, Latour argues that for contemporary environmental politics, quote, nature is the chief obstacle, end quote. Instead, Latour advocates for, quote, a political ecology that does not speak about nature and has never sought to do so. It has to do instead with associations of beings and hybridities that take complicated forms, end quote. The problem, Latour is alerting us to, is the conceptual error, widespread, he thinks, in the history of Western thought, to distinguish between that which is natural on the one hand and that which is artificial on the other hand, or what is non-human and what is human. But at first glance, this distinction seems actually helpful for environmental politics. It gives environmental politics a clear category to protect, to preserve, to conserve nature, while the artificial is not granted the same environmental protections. It also allows conservationist biologists to identify baselines in nature which we ought to try to maintain or return to. Yet Latour argues that this distinction between the natural and the artificial is actually detrimental to environmental politics because it foists or puts onto the world of bodies and actions a philosophical distinction that is always in the process of being blurred. Similarly, Timothy Morton, whose book is on the left, or yeah, you're right. Similarly, Timothy Morton has critiqued the idea of a pristine, virginal nature opposed to culture as not only bad for conservationist politics, but also false and often gendered and imperialist, ignoring the numerous ways indigenous people have interacted with the land and environment in territories and spaces the Western mind thinks of as untouched and uninhabited. In the beginning, all the world was America, John Locke said not that long ago. Instead, Morton argues in Ecology Without Nature for a deeper appreciation of the radical interconnectedness of human and non-human life and ecologies. In a provocatively titled book, Thinking Like a Mall, Environmental Philosophy After the End of Nature, Stephen Vogel makes a similar argument, but pushes us further, suggesting that we manage all protected spaces just like we would manage a shopping mall. Both, after all, Vogel contends, are built environments. The examples could be multiplied, and much of this work is as excellent as it is thought-provoking and critical, but the point I want to get across is that what binds these theorists together is their shared desire to move beyond nature as a concept, post-nature, or after nature even, as some people have begun saying, by revealing nature to be a politically and ethically bankrupt, even dangerous term. Don't get me wrong, I'm pretty sympathetic to a lot of these projects, but what I'm proposing this evening is that they miss something in their haste and boundary leveling. In other words, my claim is not that these post-nature theorists are wrong in their criticisms of the modern concept nature versus artifice as gendered, imperialist, colonialist, etc., and counterproductive for contemporary environmental politics. But that perhaps they throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater when they dump nature and its boundaries wholesale. And this is where turning to that staid and true, lumbering slow giant Aquinas, even his classmates called him the dumb ox, can be revealing. Aquinas is well remembered today for his theory of natural law, for linking law and nature. It is thus with his account of law that I want to begin to see what alternatives his thought holds. And this is a quote from his teacher, Albert the Great. It's a legend, but his classmates, when he first walked into Albert the Great's classroom, I guess started laughing because he was slow of tongue and he was a huge guy. And they said, "Oh, he's a dumb ox." And Albert the Great said, "No, you be careful. You can call him a dumb ox. I tell you, this dumb ox shall bellow so loud that his bellowing will fill the whole world." And apparently, Albert the Great was prophetic because today, everyone knows who Aquinas is. So, all right, what Aquinas thinks about law. So, Aquinas advances several claims about law in the Summa that, when considered together, reveal a peculiar conception of law that sits at odds with how we conventionally think about law as command or order or rule. This conception of law as a connective tissue, Aquinas' word is literally ligaments. I'm translating it connective tissue. Ligaments are the things that like hold your muscles together, right? Or stuff of our belonging together in community. The first claim Aquinas makes is that law between humans was not just present, but was also a necessary good in man's original state of paradise. This is a crucial point for Aquinas that differentiates him from many other Christian thinkers and their heirs who held law to have merely remedial functions as a consequence of sin. And these are legion. So you can think of Madison, who said, the American founder Madison, who said that if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary. You can think of Hobbes, who thinks of government as a reflection or an artificial thing added to help overcome the state of nature. You can think of Augustine as well, who the city of God had to be not replaced, but the city of man was a consequence of our sin. Of course, we had law, God's law, in the state of perfection, but we did not have human law. Aquinas thinks we also had human law in the state of perfection. So why? What was the point of human law in the state of perfection? In the Summa, this claim appears in the Treatise on Man, when Aquinas sets out to consider the authority, dominion or mastership proper to human beings prior to the fall. In Article 4 of Question 96, Aquinas makes a crucial distinction between the authority one wields over a slave and political or legal authority. Aquinas writes, authority has a double meaning. First, against slaves, in which sense the authority of the master means one to whom another is subject as a slave. In another sense, authority is referred in a proper sense to any kind of subject. And in this sense even, he who has the office of governing and directing free persons can be called a master. In the sense of innocence, in the state of innocence, man could have had authority in the latter sense only. So I think two things are important to note about this passage. First, in distinguishing between the authority appropriate to the master-slave relationship and the authority appropriate to the governor-free person relationship, Aquinas makes a distinction between that which is essential to interhuman political authority insofar as it is authority at all, namely governing and directing, and that which merely accrues to authority in our fallen world, coercive domination. According to Aquinas, the master-slave relationship is a product of our fallen world. There were no slaves or masters in Eden. The same is not true of the governor-free person relation, though. While both relationships contain elements of authority, only the master-slave relationship contains an added element, an element made possible only because of sin. The point is important because it allows us to appreciate the non-coercive essence of authority Aquinas sees, even if that kernel is often obscured in the fall, in our fallen world. But so let's dwell on what that kernel might look like for a minute. Perhaps even more important is Aquinas' distinction between kinds of authority, suggests something profound about how law's purpose or ends is ultimately related to justice, I think. So here, following the patristic or fathers tradition found that it follows of the church, Aquinas held Eden as a state of innocence and perfection. Consequently, justice, along with all the virtues, perfectly obtained in Eden. In other words, for Aquinas, as for nearly every Christian thinker, in Eden, justice was not simply striven for, but was obtained. It was an accomplished fact. But that means, however he theorized law, it had to have a function in excess of or superabundance to the attainment of justice. If law between humans was an affirmative primordial feature of a state of perfect justice, then law could not be said to properly intend or be directed towards the realization of justice or any of the other conditions that already obtained perfectly in Eden. So what's the point of justice? What's the point of law if it's not directed towards justice? If justice already perfectly attends or obtains in Eden, why have law? And this is what the problem that Aquinas has to address. So in the same article concerning law and authority in Eden, Aquinas raises a discussion of the common good. After affirming that law and human political authority were present in the state of innocence, Aquinas proceeds to tell us why. Because man is naturally a social animal in the state of innocence, and he would have led a social life. Now, a social life cannot exist unless the intending of the common good itself presides. When Aquinas turns to discuss the relationship between law and the common good in his treatise on law, Aquinas uses a peculiar but illuminating example, the relationship between fire and heat. Let's turn to that quote. So, now in every genus, that which belongs to it chiefly is the principle of the others, and the others belong to that genus in subordination to that thing. Thus fire, which is principal among hot things, is the cause of heat in mixed bodies. And these are said to be hot, insofar as they participate in fire. Consequently, since the law principally intends the common good, any other precept in regard to some individual work must needs be devoid of the nature of law, save insofar as it regards the common good. Therefore, every law intends the common good. So what's Aquinas saying here? Aquinas calls the relationship between fire and heat one of participation. To the extent that something is hot, it participates in or has a share in fire. Hot things, Aquinas here explains, are not the means to the goal of fire or directed towards something outside or foreign to them. What the 17th century Thomist St. John of St. Thomas called alien goods. Rather, hot things participate in or have a direct share in the doings of fire. It follows, Aquinas argued, that law is not directed towards the common good as a goal outside itself, as one might say perhaps money is directed towards the purchasing of things, but is rather a way or a mode of our participation in the common good. And this means, for Aquinas at least, that the common good is not a goal at all, not something to be obtained. It is a doing or mode of participation, the doing of which Aquinas calls law. So, and I think this is an easy way to see the distinction. Law and justice for Aquinas are not so much different things or means to achieve one or the other. But diachronic, how we typically think of the relationship between law and justice, but diachronic and synchronic explanations of the same phenomena of belonging together. When Aquinas talks about justice, he's taking a synchronic view, and we all know the distinction between synchronic and diachronic. So synchronic looks at sort of points in time, that's what's on the bottom there, and you also have an example of it over here. Here's two synchronic images, the backside of a mermaid stuck swimming and the backside of a bird stuck flying in the air. Diachrony or diachronic looks at things over time, and the top arrow pointing through time, and you have a submarine moving underwater and an airplane flying through the sky. So when he talks about law, the view is necessarily diachronic. So these are just two different, law and justice are just two different approaches to talking about the same phenomenon for Aquinas. So Aquinas offers a more sustained discussion of the common good and its relationship to law in De Caritate, so his treatise on love, that helps us see how the relationship of law and that helps us see this relationship between law and justice. Here, he explicitly rejects the idea that the common good might be something possessed by individuals. Let's see. To love the good of a city in order to appropriate and possess it for oneself is not what the good political man does. This is what the tyrant does. For thus it is that the tyrant, too, loves the good of the city in order to dominate it, which is to love oneself more than the city. In effect, it is for himself that the tyrant desires this good, and not for the city, but to love the good of the city in order that it be conserved and defended. This is truly to love the city, and it is what the good political man does, even so that, in order to conserve or augment the good of the city, he exposes himself to the danger of death and neglects his private good. Words from the 13th century. Aquinas makes clear here that the common good, in contrast to private goods, can never be possessed. The common good is of a different quality entirely from private goods. The common good is not something that can be had, but an activity that is itself diffusive, as the 20th century Thomist de Cognac puts it. In fact, the more one attempts to possess or have, to hold the common good, the more elusive it becomes. If, as Aquinas seems to be suggesting here, the common good's essential quality is to love another, figured as someone other than oneself, as the city, then there is no reason to wonder it cannot be possessed. To possess the common good is, after all, to alter its essential nature. An attempt to possess the common good is exactly what Aquinas criticizes tyranny for. The tyrant desires the common good all for himself, but fails to see how this appropriation of the common good destroys the element of the common good that attracted him to it in the first place, its diffusive commonality. This quality is palpable and real. Consequently, it can be conserved, defended, augmented. Aquinas writes, again in the Summa, just as the principal intention of human law is to create friendship between humans, human and human, so the principal intention of divine law is to establish friendship between human being and God. This is the quality that can be preserved. As Paul Weithman has argued, this passage is full of insight in how Aquinas understands law. Here, the name Aquinas gives law's principal intention is friendship, and this very Aristotelian choice of words is illuminating for two reasons. First, in the Nicomachean Ethics, on which Aquinas wrote a lengthy commentary, Aristotle makes the claim that friendship seems to hold states together, and lawgivers care more about it than justice. The pairing of law and friendship over justice is similar to the conclusion we drew above. Friendship, like law, as participation in the common good, is an ongoing activity, the end of which lies not in completion, but in its ongoingness. It is a give and take relationship. Friendship, like law, requires work. This is why I believe it is hard for many to theorize an aboriginal function or non-coercive quality distinctive to law. Work, it seems, should be absent from paradise, yet this is not how Aquinas understands paradise: nature, work, and embodiment. Here, Aquinas takes an Aristotelian line against the more Neoplatonist trend that dominated medieval Christian interpretations of the Eden narrative. These trends prioritized the role of spirit over body, and so excluded from paradise the more bodily acts of existence. For Aquinas, though, and he is adamant here, eating, defecating, sex, the work of dressing and keeping the garden, and even natural death were all attendant aspects of our original Eden existence. And you remember Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, when the elves die, and they, how can elves die? We all know elves die. That's not the question. But how could we die in Eden? This, Tolkien was a reader of Aquinas, and there's a lot of speculation that he was thinking here about how a perfect body in the state of Eden could die and could pass into another world. So this is the elves in the middle world passing over into Valeria, or I think that's the name of one of our administrators, not the name of the other world for Tolkien, but you get what I'm saying. So every bodily power is finite, Aquinas reminds us. The bodily work of caring for the land, for our bodies, and the friendship between us is not considered by Aquinas to be a curse foisted on us by a vengeful God spiteful of our original disobedience, but part of paradise and an intimate delight. This work includes the work of law, is an aboriginal feature of our existence. But what's the reality of this work? How does this work? How does this law matter? How can it be touched, or can it be touched? It would seem to exist not just in words for Aquinas, because it's the natural and divine law, but it's also not physical. So this is what I want to turn to next. How can we get to the reality, or to the thisness of whatever this connective tissue is that he's talking about here? So I'm going to touch on that briefly. Let's see, what time is it? Do you know how much time I have?
I have like 5-10 minutes.
5-10 minutes. Okay. All right. So let's listen to how Aquinas defines nature in the Summa Contra. So he writes, nature is in keeping with that which occurs. Nature is in keeping with that which usually happens for the most part, but is not in keeping with what always occurs, because many natural causes produce their effects in the same way usually, but not always, since sometimes it happens otherwise, either due to a defect in power of an agent, or to the unsuitable condition of the matter, or to an inferior agent with greater strength. as when nature gives rise to a sixth finger on a human. Nature, Aquinas here suggests, is what happens usually, but not always. Indeed, Aquinas seems emphatic, repeating it 3 times in this short passage. Nature is neither universal nor controlling, but shot through with the ever-present possibility of contingency. Nature is what happens for the most part, contextual, historical, and imbricated with the contingencies of defective agents, as when nature gives rise to a sixth finger on a human. But the really interesting point is not simply that Aquinas does not use nature here in a typical modern fashion to denote a universal determinative realm. What is interesting, I think, is that for Aquinas, there's nothing normative at all about nature. The child born with a sixth finger is natural, but not normal. This account of nature is in stark contrast to how many of Aquinas' modern readers interpret him. These readers understand Aquinas to offer a list of moral rules derived from a universal nature. For these modern interpreters, Thomistic nature provides a normative foundation applicable to all people and all times. I am claiming that Aquinas' question was different. The question posed by nature for Aquinas did not discuss morality on this basis. Instead, he was concerned with boundaries, such as the boundaries between the natural and its others, and the questions about how these boundaries are produced, generated, and even multiplied. What Aquinas is concerned with is not the normative conclusions that may be deduced from these boundaries, but rather in how the natural divides itself and generates difference. So I wanted to give an example from contrapuntal music. So there's been quite a bit of talk about how scholastic disputation and contrapuntal music sort of developed together. Both were sort of scholastic disputation is in a give and take where you there's a response. A question and a response, and this is similar to how contrapuntal music has voices that talk, but I don't have enough time for that, so I'm going to skip this section. But we can talk about that I want to jump to the conclusion. Okay, so Aquinas charts a non-binary, non-universal account of nature that is certainly sympathetic to contemporary critiques that correctly problematize modernity's nature-culture dualism as artificial, gendered, and imperialistic. Nevertheless, Aquinas decidedly retains, or rather remembers for us, a concept of nature, reminding us what we lose when we jettison nature, that is, when we go post-natural. What we lose when we go post-natural is a certain care, or rather respect, for practical boundaries that make friendship possible. This care for Aquinas is central to the human capacity to belong and work for friendship with the more than human ecological processes we cohabit and which make our creaturely lives possible and meaningful. Ultimately, this friendship, like any friendship, goes beyond merely acknowledging interconnectedness, as important and difficult as that in itself may be, and requires a certain care for and respect for boundaries. It is this task of retaining and continuing to care for boundaries in a world that has rightly begun to move away from modernity's nature-culture binaries, which Aquinas theorizes for us today, and presents as a task important for contemporary politics. But to conclude, why should nature, and this is where I started, why should nature as a concept be retained in contemporary environmental political theory? And how can Aquinas' account of natural law help give us an answer? One, despite the similarity, Aquinas' and the post-nature theorists' recognition of the blurriness between nature and its others, they have drastically different approaches or methods for dealing with it. The contemporary post-nature theorists' response seems to be straightforward. Namely, the blurriness reveals boundaries to be false and imposed to begin with. Let's do away with them. This response surely has its merits, and I do not want to underplay them because they have been hard fought for. Erasing the boundaries allows us to better appreciate the deep, radical interconnectedness between human and non-human as well as fosters a more modest, realistic account of human agency, both of which seems crucial in advancing a more embracive and democratic politics. But Aquinas pursues a different response to this blurriness. He encountered to the blurriness he encounters between nature and its others, and I want to explore this for a moment. Rather than erase the distinctions, Aquinas multiplies the distinctions. Indeed, rather than take the blurriness of boundary between what we moderns call nature and culture as a reason for dismissing it, Aquinas plumbs the boundary line with a certain ferocity, perhaps characteristic only of a scholastic in their love of distinction, giving us not just the natural and artificial, these are Aquinas' terms, but also the supernatural, the preternatural, and the unnatural. And we can talk more about that in discussion time if you're interested. And I want to suggest that this method of multiplying distinctions, this care for drawing and redrawing boundaries in the face of their blurriness, is a direct consequence of his natural law theory and interest in law. And just as an aside, I find this really interesting. Derrida called this limitrophy, and he was just sort of late on the scene by only 700 years. So that's another funny point. 2. Aquinas' multiplication of the distinctions between nature and its others, rather than their erasure, allows him to give an account of what is distinctive about nature, and so help us see what we might be losing when we jettison nature. And this leads to Aquinas' rather peculiar sounding, at least to modern ears, definition of nature as, quote, what happens usually, but not always. Not only is nature a non-static or non-binary concept for Aquinas, as we have seen, but is also non-static. It is historical. It has a history. Nature is not some pristine wilderness untouched by human hands, nor is it a universal moral foundation. Nature is simply and prosaically what happens usually, but not always. It is the human more than human force. Aquinas' term is sublunary, under the moon, producing tendencies, rhythms, and refrains, which human beings don't simply cohabit with other critters, but can pursue friendship with. What we lose then when we jettison nature, as a concept, it seems to me, is not some pristine place or wilderness. What we lose is also not some conservationist baseline or moral standard. I think Aquinas would agree with jettisoning all these, or would rather be perplexed why we cling so desperately to them. No, what we risk losing is a certain distance or appreciation for the boundaries that both connects and protects, like the walls of a city, a care and respect for boundaries which is crucial to our friendship, including the possibility of friendship with nature. And last, just one more paragraph. The problem then is not with the acknowledgement of interconnectedness, which is what the post-nature theorists are great at. Indeed, this is a vital necessity for environmental politics. The problem, I think, is one, the under-theorization. Not that there is none, just that there is not enough attention that has been devoted yet to the distance and boundaries needed in order for this acknowledgement of interconnection to have the hoped-for salutary effects. And 2, the work necessary to draw, redraw, care, and maintain these boundaries. I think Aquinas shows us we should not shy away from thinking about what is distinctively human, what is distinctively bovine or aquiline, or what is distinctively cow-like or eagle-like or human-like, about what our distinctively human responsibilities are and may be. In the end, we shouldn't, I think, only be able to care for something, Aquinas suggests, because we are like it. And this would mean, I think, acceding to a thinking that thinks the absence of agency otherwise as something other than privation or not having it. So I think, we didn't do that. I think, yep, I'll end there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Zach. I think we might actually make some kind of decision about this American habit of reading the papers, because, I don't know, in America everybody reads the paper from the texts, right? And in European tradition people try to talk. Because I found myself understanding much more than Zach actually, looked at the audience and said something, as opposed to he was, maybe, yeah. I know this is what everybody does in America, but maybe we could, Anyways, so questions.
Thank you, Zach, for your talk. I have a very simple question. I think it's a more historical one. Can we return to Aquinas and his wisdoms without returning to God-centered world? And I think it has consequences to the understanding of humans' position toward gods and toward nature as a part of creation. Thank you.
Right. I don't think I'm suggesting that we can return to Aquinas without turning to his conception of God or his theology either. I'm not trying to bracket one or the other. I'm very interested in Aquinas' theology and his explanation that divine law or divine law is also our friendship with God, and that this is embedded in a deep theology. What I'm trying to do is show that for Aquinas, in his natural philosophy, the supernatural is a distinct mode of acting. The supernatural is when he defines the natural as what happens usually, but not always. The supernatural is the suspension of what happens usually, but not always. So, like when God split the Red Sea, this was a suspension of what happens usually, but not always. So when Aquinas talks about God in his natural philosophy sections, he gives God the place of an agent or an agent description, not a divine, not like a divine being, and I find that interesting. So there's different modes of being or modes of acting. There's the supernatural way of acting, which God fulfills. There's the natural way of acting. There's the preternatural way of acting, but it's not clear that it's this very Christian-centric account of God at that moment.
One of the central binding agents in medieval society, as far as Aquinas was concerned, was the sacrament of the Eucharist, which is a miracle, and it's one that happens usually every Sunday, or perhaps every day in Mass. So it's both what happens usually, and yet it's something that causes something unnatural to happen, namely transubstantiation. Does this figure into your theory in any way?
Thank you, John. The Eucharist and transubstantiation. No, simply I had not. It's an interesting concept, but that's found in the third part of the Summa, which I haven't dealt with, and I would be interested to think how that might. It's definitely not part of his natural philosophy writing, but I'd be interested to think about how that might. This is, I guess, similar to Evgeny's question. How you can't separate, what I take to be Evgeny's question. You can't separate Aquinas's natural philosophy from his theology. So, can you say more about how you would bridge the two? And I think that's an important question.
Can you open the slide with this quote with the definition of nature? Because I think that was one of the central quotes in your talk, and that was something I didn't understand, apparently. Oh, yeah, here it is, yeah. So I think you said that this definition somehow runs contrary to the modern reading of Aquinas, who thinks that nature can be used as a kind of the law, the natural law of how things happen. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit? So why this fact that nature doesn't work all the time, but usually works, right? It works in most cases. Why is it? Why does it contradict the notion, the idea that nature is this universal kind of guideline? You know, the universal sets the universal rules, right? Which, yeah, why is it the fact that rules don't work 100% of the times? Why does it mean that there are not rules?
Right. That's a really good question. This quote here is part of Aquinas's definition of nature as happening usually but not always, and just because it happens usually but not always, you're right, doesn't mean that a rule couldn't be universal. What I'm trying to, what the argument here has to be connected back up to what I was saying about law in the first part of the talk, that that law for Aquinas is not about command or rule, but that law is about the connective tissue. Law is about the ligament. Law is about the relationality between people or between communities. When we take law to mean rule or command or order, then certainly you might have a rule that happens usually, but not always, and it might be. You might say that fine, it's not universal, but it's nearly universal. It's not a scientific physical law. It's not Newton's law, but it's close. So we'll call it an approximate physical law. That's why I spent so much time first trying to redefine, not redefine, but pull out how Aquinas actually talks about law in terms of its relational character, and that law for Aquinas is about the connections between things, not a order or not a rule. There's not a rule that governs a bunch of cases. Aquinas doesn't think about law as rule governing cases. Does that make sense, or some?
Maybe my question as well. So since you invited it, what is unnatural first? And then, do you have examples of some ligaments from Aquinas? And then finally, on one hand, you've talked about ligaments connecting. On the other hand, you've talked about the practice of law as friendship and respecting boundaries. So could you elaborate on kind of that complementary play between connective ligaments and friendship maintaining boundaries? But also, what is unnatural?
Thank you. All right. Right, so unnatural is a translation of contra naturam for Aquinas. And it's not part of nature. There's the natura, there's the supranatura, there's the preternatura, but then there's this contra naturam, and it's. I'm thinking of the contra naturam as like this, this like space outside. I don't really know how this works. So I'd be interested to hear more what you're thinking about the unnatural. One way I had started thinking about it is so there's there's also the artificial. So there's the natural, the supernatural, the preternatural, and the artificial, and then there's the contra naturam. And the artificial seems to be like the space or the mode of agency in which humans, but it can also be bees and cranes and some very social animals, birds and spiders as well. Not even social, but that they mix their bodies with labor to produce nests, to produce communities, to produce webs. A web is an artificial construction, but. And then unnatural is something Aquinas usually talks about the unnatural for the most part in terms of his moral philosophy, in terms of his sexual condemnations. So I think that's important to keep in mind. So there's like proper use or proper way to mix human bodies with labor with the world, and improper ways to do them is sort of the way to think about the natural, the artificial, and the unnatural. So yeah, I'm interested in that distinction too. Examples of ligaments from Aquinas. So, like the examples would be examples of law from Aquinas. So, like the sublunary realm, Aquinas talks a bit about, or he talks quite extensively about the different. He talks about it in terms of analogia entis, or the analogy of being, and this to me is where the ligaments exist. He thought that things were related not just in terms of a univocal relationship, or where everything was related equally to one another, or an equivocal relationship where everything withdrew from one another, but that everything had something of a interrelationality with one another. So no, I know that's not to answer your question. I don't have stuff. I don't have like an example where I'd say like this is like the tree or the fingers or something. But that's and maybe Aquinas gives some, but I don't know if he does.
Oh, the other part.
Oh, what's the other part?
The interplay between ligament and boundary and friendship. The governance of law, or the practice of law, has to do with an interruption or some maintenance of the ligament in boundary.
Yeah, this is a good question. So this goes to a really old question in jurisprudence between sort of breaching and shoring up boundaries, or Hannah Arendt thinks about it in terms of the tension between the Greek nomos, the word for the walls of the city, which shored up, were held in, contained, and the Roman lex, which was a connective. The Romans built alliances, the Greeks built walls. And this is similar to the boundaries and to the ligaments. This is certainly the same theoretical terms I'm trying to play with in Aquinas. Fitzpatrick plays with them in terms of breaching and shoring up, and with Freud as well. But am I doing anything unique with them? I think you're asking. I don't know. I should reframe that. Can we find Aquinas to be doing anything unique with them? I guess I'll have to think on that. But I'm drawn to Aquinas because there's several spaces in which there's breachings. There's not just a breaching between one space between the natural and the artificial. There's a breaching between the supernatural and the natural. There's a breaching between the preternatural and the natural and the supernatural. There's multiple sort of realms of this shoring up and breaching. So I think there's this plurality of spaces of shoring up and breaching that make Aquinas a bit more sort of muddled, but also more interesting. That's possibly more interesting than someone like Arendt or Fitzpatrick. But no, that's a good question, or a good way to frame it.
Thanks, Zach, for your talk. So, concerning this definition here of nature as that what happens usually but not always, what is exactly the added value of this concept within your theory as opposed to a definition that would simply be nature as that what happens? So, what is the exact added value within your account of this?
Thank you, Louis. Right. So what's the added value of happens usually? And this, I certainly didn't make clear enough, is that it's the tendential or the rhythmic possibilities that come out in what happens usually. The natural for Aquinas has an element of refrain to it. It has a counterpuntal element to it. It does have a very usual and there's a luring element to it. It's not just contingent. It's not just radical contingency. And it's this element of tendency that you can put in contrast to a lot of post-nature scholarship that just wants to talk about the radical contingency of nature. And I think that this is where Aquinas is also able to talk about maintaining friendship with nature. So it's in the spot of the usualness, and not just the nature is what happens. It's in the spot of the tendency, in the regularity, in the refrains that one can build a home, that one can find a spot in an abode, a spot to live. That I find Aquinas to be useful. Can you say more?
Does he go so far as to say that when something unusual happens, then it is not natural anymore?
Yes. Yeah. So he says that it happens quite frequently that human nature can change. Let me find. I can find you the quote somewhere.
Well, but then the question is, if it's not natural, what is it then?
Preternatural. What's wrong with that? It's preternatural means it's tangential to the usual happenings of things. It becomes circular. Why?
We want to understand what is, well, if something is unusual, it's not natural anymore. And you're saying, well, if it's not natural anymore, then it is unusual or contagion.
Okay. Oh, I see. Yeah, but
I'm not an expert at all of Aquinas, so I would like to know how you interpret this concept of not being, or let's say, unusual or contagion as not being natural. What exactly could it be?
all right.
Does it come in your theory on political ecology? Is it important or is it not?
Is contingency important?
Yes. Unusualness and Aquinas or your theory, what then the unusual, the contingent, or the not natural exactly would be for the amateur, the non-expert?
Right. Yeah. I think. Thank you. So the quote that I missed. Let me see if it's down there. There's another quote from the Summa. Has to do with the indeterminacy of nature in Aquinas, and I think this is a spot where you find something of the contingent, or a spot for the contingent. I do believe, or how I read Aquinas, is that there is space for the contingency, and that is in how that's not even just an aspect of human failure to know, but that's how the universe manifests itself. And so let's see, in the Summa, Aquinas also writes, human nature is changeable. That which is natural to a human may sometimes, aliquando is the Latin, fail at any time. I guess what does it become at that point? Does it become preternatural, or does it just become a moment of contingency? I guess that returns to your first question. That's a good point. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not a preternatural happening. Maybe this is something that's. What are you calling it? You're calling it contingent?
You call it contagious first, and I would agree that yes, that sticks to the unusual. And if I interpret this correctly, it seems that this is a preternatural, and it seems to me something like the divine intervention or something related to that.
Divine intervention?
That's not what I'm reading up there. I'm reading that preternatural means that it's a natural that's...
Sorry.
Use the mic, otherwise we don't get recording.
Sorry. So what I'm seeing up there is the preternatural is a relational term, which means that it's not naturally known to humans, but perhaps could become natural. And that might be part of the changing nature of human nature that you were referring to in the other quote. Because it says, it is a preternatural marvel with respect to us.
But why then not the divine if it is not known to us?
Because it will be known.
Right. So, I mean, that quote, so how cognosco, it's actually noto. So how known to us is cognosco is usually the word, how known is translated, but here it's the word Aquinas uses is noto, which means a sign or a hint, which is interesting. If nature, how I'm reading this is nature is signing or hinting at its own indeterminacy, which is different from being known to us. This is different from. This is not something that is. This is why I have indeterminacy versus uncertainty. One would be to read it in terms of an epistemological, is this a question of what is known to us, or is this what the universe or nature itself is projecting? Is it a sign of the universe, or is it an epistemological problem that we have? And I take this quote, I take Aquinas to be arguing here that it's not a problem with the human perceiver, but it's one of the universe.
No, that's not what Duskin said.
That's not what Justin. I was disagreeing.
Especially for me, it's not.
Stop, please. 1 second.
Because what you're saying, Zach, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is that in the end, even contingencies or unexpected things can be ontologically part of nature, So then we are in contradiction with what Aquinas, or what you claim Aquinas said, that when it is unusual, it is not nature anymore, because he said what happens usually, but not always is nature. In other words, if something unusual happens, it's not nature anymore. But, well, you see, I see a little problem here. I don't know if it is important, but... Can you say it one more time? What you said and what is written here can indeed, I think, well be understood as that unusual or contingent things are part of nature. We don't know them yet, we cannot predict them, so for us they look as marvels, but still they are ontologically, so epistemologically we find it unexpected or unusual, but deep down on nature's level, ontologically speaking, it is still natural. In other words, this seems in contradiction with what we heard before, that if something unusual happens, it is not nature anymore. Is there a contradiction, or is it just...
No, I don't think it's a contradiction, because deep down it's contingent. It's not natural, though. Deep down, nature is what happens usually, but not always. Okay, and this is how humans grasp it, how humans understand it, and this is the way we live and operate in the world, and the world we make sense of. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that exist outside that are contingent, that exist in a wider universe. It also doesn't mean that there aren't these signs, these hints from Noto, from the universe that are radically contingent. Aquinas, nature for Aquinas is a small subset of physical reality. Nature is not the full scope of physical reality. What Aquinas brings us today.
Especially his way of dividing, or let's say of distinguishing nature from other realms of reality.
Right. Good. No, and that's a serious question. But what I think Aquinas brings us today, and why I think it's helpful, is because he has us focus on just the he has us focus on a sublunary realm, which is the world below the sun, a very phenomenological realm, the realm of human and worldly interaction. This is sort of maybe it's too quaint, maybe it's too earthy or earthbound, but this is one thing that Aquinas allows us to do. Another thing Aquinas allows us to do, I think, is he allows us to focus on something that is something like the pursuit of friendship, and he calls it friendship with these processes. And what would it mean to become friends and to work at friendship with the sublunar realm, with the more than human processes that we are involved with? I think that these are worthwhile concepts, or worthwhile debates. And yes, maybe keeping a broader concept of nature as physicists talk about it in post-Einstein or post-quantum mechanics is important if we're trying to send things to the moon or to Mars. I'm not trying to make that argument that there aren't advances in science that Aquinas is going to be good for quantum mechanics. That's not my argument.
Oh, I'll just tell Zach later.
All right. I know it seems to me that there are kind of two thrusts to your presentation, right? And the one is about how to interpret these quotes of Aquinas, and I kind of see Louis' point here, because I mean, to me, that sounds like nature is everything. Because I mean, if something happens which we can understand, well, it's natural. If something happens which we cannot understand, it is governed by natural power unknown to us. Right? So what else can happen? Everything happening is natural, therefore, right? But maybe we just misperceive the word nature because, unlike you, we are not into Aquinas. But the second thrust of your paper is like contemporaneous, right? I mean, you started by saying that Latour and others who want to dismantle the concept of nature, although they do a good thing, you know, politically somehow, and useful things, still you're not satisfied with them, and this is your attempt to kind of to take a different view. Could you give an example of how the consequences of this approach differ in, let's say, the realm of political decisions? Like, for example, you mentioned that, well, it allows you to theorize friendship better. So do you mean that if you follow Latour, there is no friendship somehow, or friendship is weaker, but if you follow this line of thought, then you have additional arguments? So what would be the difference in terms of how we do ecological thinking today, depending on whether we take the critics of nature and Aquinas on the other hand?
Thank you. Right. So not friendship in general, like friendship between humans. I don't know what Latour thinks about that. I'm interested between friendship, this concept between, is it possible to be friends with the more than human spaces and more than human world? And what I think one Aquinas and this approach allows you to get at, or allows but this this has 2 points. Allows you to get at is the not just the interactions of things or hybridities things in a ecology, but also their dependencies and relatedness to one another. The more important point, I think, is, and this is your policy, not policy recommendation, but how would you do environmental politics different? And I think how you do environmental politics different is that, so Latour and people like Morton, the people I started out with, their environmental politics comes to something like Vogel's thinking like a mall. How do we manage protected spaces? Well, we have no way to distinguish between the natural and the artificial anymore. It's a bad concept. Let's get rid of it. Let's think of them on a horizontal plane. I find that to be a problematic assumption. It's one that I'm trying to criticize with Aquinas. I believe that there should be distinctions between the natural and the artificial. I think Aquinas gives us rich ways to theorize distinctions between the natural and the artificial, and that we can see some also in today's practicing conservationist biologists, particularly some that are working in fields like rewilding. They're doing things that are somewhat a blend of Latourian hybridity and conservation. They're not just saying, oh, there's a difference between a protected space that's natural that we just are conserving and and human artificial space. What they're doing is they're trying to reintroduce sometimes cloned animals, sometimes foreign species like lions migrants to the prairies of North America to try to bring back large predators to habitats that used to have large predators in these areas. I think my intervention with Aquinas would be part of this type of conservation politics.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Zachary.